Welcome to The Whole Pineapple. I'm Ruby Boris.
And I'm Ann Judge. The Whole Pineapple is a podcast about wellness focused around fertility. And on these weekly mini episodes, we bring you bite-sized ideas for you to snack on.
Like breathing exercises, book reviews. Maybe we'll review some scientific research, or we'll share some wellness and fertility stories from our listeners.
So if you're looking for a tip or a trick related to your fertility and well-being, then you've come to the right place.
Let's dig in. Man, it has been a while since we picked these books out and we told you all that we were going to review them, but we are here. We are finally going to do it. Meaning me, Ruby.
And Ann, hi.
Hi.
First book review of 2023, so that's good.
Right.
And we got a double feature, so that's fun too.
Yeah, same author, two different books, both pretty amazing. Although I didn't read the one that you did, Anne, so I can't really comment.
Yes, no, I feel like I skipped ahead to the advanced textbook since mine was on the later series. I feel like I need to go back and read yours just to confirm, but I bet there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah, for sure. I would say that that's pretty accurate. Mine's kind of like the manual that you wish you would have had to learn about your body, and then yours is like the second in the series as you progress to a different stage of your life. So today I am covering The Vagina Bible by Dr. Jen Gunter.
And I am the Menopause Manifesto by Dr. Jen Gunter. So yeah, Ruby is going to teach you all about everything. And then mine is like, the range that happens at the end. So we'll start with yours. But yeah, I love my book and I definitely want to read yours too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And, you might get a little bit fired up with the Vagina Bible, too, because one thing that Jen does is she does go all the way back in history, kind of like we did with our Hysteria episode. And this is why we do these things in medicine today. There are, as Anne says, there are echoes throughout history and there are reasons and things that kind of go from decade to century over the course of time. And sometimes it's for the best and sometimes it really should have been left way back
in the
long
dustbin
ago.
Of history. Yeah.
That's right. So the Vagina Bible, the subtitle is The Vulva and the Vagina, Separating the Myth from the Medicine, which that's really what it is. It's a lot of debunking. It's basically like a frequently asked questions answered by an OBGYN and women's health expert, which is great. I wish I would have had this as I was younger because even now, I don't think we do a great job of informing girls and women about their bodies. One of the things that I like the best is how she opens this.
Okay.
She says, I have a vagenda for every woman to be empowered with accurate information about the vagina and vulva. And then she goes on to describe the importance of informed consent in medicine and how providers are tasked to provide information about risks and benefits to help our patients and to help them make the choices that work best for them and their bodies. And she says, this only works if the information is accurate and unbiased. And unfortunately, we don't always get accurate and unbiased information, especially when it comes to women. She does point out, think about all the ways that things are marketed to women. So they're marketed as pure or natural, things like clean, things like that. And it all goes back to the idea of women needing to be pure and the purity of women and their reproductive organs kind of thing.
Did you see the viral thing a couple years ago when they actually did have the Bic for her pens that were pink and everyone was writing all the reviews about did not stop flow at all. Very inefficient. And yeah. So
yeah, those reviews were so entertaining. I definitely went down because there was hundreds of pages of reviews.
Oh, yeah.
It made my day.
Yeah. But you're right. I mean, things are marketed in this weird way. And that comes across in the menopause book as well, too, with this whole idea of, what's natural in your body and playing into all these fears. So, yeah, I'm sure it's not a problem that goes away even when your ovarian function changes.
Absolutely. And there's a quote on the cover of the book by Ayelet Waldman, another New York Times bestselling author, who really sells it by saying, buy this book if you have a vagina or you spend any time at all in a reasonably close proximity to one. And I'm like, that's exactly, yes. So it is just I think it's aptly named The Vagina Bible. Answers questions anything about lubrication, pain with sex, why is the speculum exam uncomfortable or should it be, pelvic floor, STIs, and considerations for cervical cancer, contraception, like basically anything. But the most important thing I really think is the very first chapter, because it talks all about anatomy and what's normal and what's not, because there is a lot of societal input on what a normal vulva and vagina should be. And she does a really good job because the very first couple pages like go into what the difference is between a vulva and a vagina, which probably some people might not know the difference, but the vulva is on the outside. It's the outside of your anatomy, and the vagina is actually the internal part. That's important to know because you'll hear people say, like, talking about the vagina, but also actually referring to the vulva.
I mean, that's one of my medical pet peeves is people's concept of just like the lady parts. Anything down there is vagina, you know?
Totally.
And
Just
it's like, that's not exactly
if
true.
it's between the belly button
Yeah.
and your like mid femur, it's the vagina. But one of the really important things, and I know we both want to cover this, either have somebody join us as a guest on it or do another book review, is talking about the clitoris and how it's really just not in medical textbooks very much. It usually gets like a little one-liner or like a tiny little arrow to this, oh, it's right there kind of thing.
Yeah.
But there's never any detailed discussion in medical textbooks. So no wonder female sexual pleasure and things are put on the back burner and no one really tends to address them.
Except in South Park. Do you remember the South Park episode?
I have not watched South Park in a long time.
Oh my gosh. I don't even remember what the overarching theme is, but all of a sudden one of them is like finds the clitoris and it's just this giant glowing peak orb. It's like, I am the clitoris. And it's like, I am a mythical. And yeah, it's so when you say that's what I picture is the
you would think it's a mythical creature. Clitoris and Nessie. Did she include anything like that in the menopause book?
Yeah. So the menopause book is great because although it's a little bit more focused on the menopause part, it has the same kind of things in the beginning where you start off with this historical view. I love though also same thing, like the very first part of the book. She starts off with, if menopause were on Yelp, it would have 1 star. Establishment has temperature control issues. Drenching heat followed by terrible chills. Defies laws of thermodynamics. Would not recommend. Awful, awful, awful. Bleeding scheduled but rebooked without notification and arrived 3 weeks later than expected while I was in Uber and flooded the car. Driver gave me a review. Also, the sex was dry. So yeah, these books are going to have humor but kind of hit to the same sort of stuff. And what I really like is when you're thinking about the books together, she points out in the Menopause Manifesto how, you know, really menopause is puberty in reverse. But we talk about them in such different ways that you have, you know, your ovaries, and they're going to be going through different functions at different phases in your life. And yet we celebrate this one transition of puberty when your ovaries start ovulating. And this is something that people really talk about and have a lot of excitement about sometimes. But yet when it comes to on the other side, you know, menopause, we just don't address it the same way. And I also just, even before I get to that intro, one of my favorite parts was her dedication. Let me get back to it. She says, this book is for every woman. Your awesomeness is unrelated to your estrogen.
I never have thought about it that way. And it is basically like a different puberty.
Yeah, it's a different phase. And that's so much of the way that we've talked about menopause historically and medically is because it's seen through this eye of a disease model, that it's a failure in the ovaries and that that's not true.
And most people are scared about menopause, like not looking forward to it.
And she has this great example. She's like, that it only seems that way because you're comparing the bodies that do this to the bodies that don't. And that comparing people this way, she says, would be the same as comparing the liver with the heart. The liver is not weak or diseased because it doesn't beat like the heart. And therefore, women are not diseased because the ovaries stop making estrogen. That, you know, you have different functions at different times in your life. And, you know, it is kind of interesting, though. She points out the whale is the only other mammal that has a lifespan beyond menopause. So we are a little bit of an anomaly there. But in her history chapter, probably just like in yours, she really kind of goes through, you know, the history of the word and the context. And it's a cool time for this book because it is the 200th anniversary of the term menopause.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, a French physician. So it's from the Greek word, actually, menes, which is Greek for month, and then pause, which is Greek for cessation. And even if we have some challenges maybe with the term menopause, like it was definitely a step up. Historically, they used to refer to things as, what do they call it? women's inferno or women's winter or the death of sex. So out of having my women's winter, I guess menopause is still probably a slightly better term there.
Yeah, I'll take that one.
But, she points out the typical lifespan, you're going to spend about a third to half your life postmenopausal. So this is not some maybe it was evolutionarily that you only lived a couple of years after, but there are a lot of reasons in the historical chapter too, where you see the great benefit to people that are living. And if you think about evolutionarily how risky that time of pregnancy was for you, those that got past that phase and could now focus on all the other ways they were helping society actually were very revered and had a lot to offer society. So this is not just some quirk of us as a species living beyond menopause, that there are reasons to think that this is a really important time in life.
There's actually a section in my book that talked about history as well that I really liked. And it was about whether the speculum, the bivalve speculum, has a racist history. So the speculum is that instrument that you use, that your gynecologist or midwife or nurse practitioner provider uses to look on the inside of the vagina and to visualize the cervix and things like that. And it didn't always look the way it is. So like a lot of people think of it as like a duckbill looking thing. So there have been many different versions of this, and there is one man named Marion Sims that a lot of people attribute the speculum to. He was a gynecologist. He treated a lot of women for fistulas that for some women, white women, he would treat with anesthesia, and then with Black women, he did not treat with anesthesia. And there was a lot of very unethical experimentation, really. Which
we covered briefly in our episode 1 back in first season. So
that's right, we did. A lot of people have heard that he's been called the father of modern gynecology. I really don't think that's the case either. And I do retroactively revoke his medical license. He did not, in fact, invent the bivalve speculum. And actually, in 1825, Marie Anne Boivin, a French midwife, modified the speculum, and a version of her creation is what we use today. Dr. Gunter wrote, and this just really made me laugh, and I was like, yes, I totally feel this. It is infuriating that in addition to all the medically unethical and racist things that Sims did to women, he also erased the fact that the bivalve speculum was created by a woman.
Mm-hmm.
So just like, yes. Okay. And then one of the other things, this is kind of different, but one of the things I did really like about this book is it includes a whole chapter on transgender bodies, transgender women, and transgender men. Chapter 3 is titled Vaginas and Vulvas in Transition, and it's several pages, and certainly there's other books that dive into this in more detail and are dedicated to this, the health of transgender and genderqueer people. But I really did like that she included this, and there's some good information in there as well.
What were some of the other key things that you really liked about your book?
I believe it's the very last chapter, or close to the end, chapter 46. It's called Internet Hygiene and Apps, and it's basically telling you how to find good, reliable, accurate information on the internet, because these days it's really hard. And there are some sites that look super legitimate. The other thing that I really liked, there's a section on old wives' tales. And
oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And this, again, goes back to the hysteria episode. She has a little paragraph about magnets next to your vagina for hot flashes and vaginal steaming. Does anybody remember that? Deja vu from hysteria episode.
Mine goes into a little bit too, like when you're looking at that historical view of everything. Again, it's so similar to our hysteria episode, but you're kind of talking about the fact that a lot of problems are because women are too moist and they have humors in all these different ways. And that's why they're having to release them. And so one of these early doctors also, many people thought menstrual blood was toxic, and he didn't go quite that far, but he thought that it did have morbid humors, but that men had those too. And that's why they had to release them via hemorrhoids. So I read that. And I told my husband, I was like, oh, so, hemorrhoids are your periods if you're having that. But you just love people working within the knowledge that they had at the time to be like, well, it looks like men have some blood in the lady parts region too, right? That's probably their vagina. It's just all down there. So let's just say it's the same thing and really see those morbid humors. So
yeah, man.
What I like, one of the themes throughout the book too, is just kind of those continued comparisons by the way that we treat medical conditions when they affect, ovaries and uterus. And she talks a little bit about, again, how much language can shape things, that we've talked in multiple episodes in season 1 about how erectile dysfunction is really a marker of heart health and all these other things in the body. She's like, but we don't call that the erectopause. Like, why don't we just talk about the fact that when you start having changes in blood flow to the penis, that's also a sign of other changes. It's just like all these things where you act like the ovaries are exhausted or ovarian failure, and none of that is really the proper way to look at something. So yeah, I love the early stuff. I love all the historical chapters. And then much like your book, I think that she goes into these detailed, more medically focused chapters where she really kind of outlines, what are the health concerns that people have when it comes to both menopause and especially treatment. So what are the things that we worry about in terms of osteoporosis and breast cancer and heart health? And she does a great job kind of outlining why we've kind of swung back and forth when it comes to hormone therapy. And even that, the language is fascinating, because I know when I was in school, and probably you too, everybody called it HRT, so hormone replacement therapy, which implies that you're like replacing something that should be there. And so now she's like, no, we call it MHT, so menopausal hormone treatment. So it's like, yeah, you're on menopausal hormone treatment. You're not on hormone replacement treatment, because you're not trying to replace. If you were trying to mimic the estrogen levels that you have in those ovulatory years, I mean, that's a scary amount of estrogen. That is what you'd worry about in terms of the complications. And for people that don't follow it closely, the controversy from this Women's Health Initiative study, which is what kind of terrified everybody about the idea of having women on hormones, is just fascinating to look at. I mean, you see the reasons, and it's such a cool story, and she does a good job outlining it.
That's one of the reasons I want to read that section, because that in particular, like, still to this day, whenever we talk about, I guess MHT, there's always this in the background, like, worry about things that it could cause issues with.
And it was such a drastic swing. So like in the 1990s, she said 42% of women were taking hormone therapy, and now it's 5% of menopausal women. And so, and even though we've had a lot of really reassuring data since then, and that's why it's supposed to be this individualized discussion about risk benefit and timing and when and what and dosing, I think some people are still just scared to think about any sort of hormone treatment. And it's really quite a shame. And it's a really great chapter to see how science can just be sort of misinterpreted by lay press, especially, you just get these alarming headlines about everything. And it's really hard to dial back from that, especially something that part of the reason that, people were so reactive is this is a condition that people just weren't talking openly about before. And so you kind of felt like people were already not being listened to. And then the first thing that got main attention was something scary.
Exactly. And we talked a little bit about that when we were talking about letrozole and Clomid too, studies on cancer and things like that. So it happens quite frequently in medicine, actually.
Definitely. And I also could not love more her chapter, basically just ripping apart bioidentical hormones and all of the challenges and why it's a made up thing. At the very end, she's like, I expect to get hate mail from this chapter, which she also says with a good chapter on supplements. She also has great chapters on lifestyle and nutrition and how to so no one's saying take some hormones, that's all it takes. The idea is you've got to have this really individualized approach. And Jessa makes a really good point, the fact that menopause and the changes that happen are not happening in a vacuum. Like the time that this is happening in terms of the change in your ovarian function is also often a time of a lot of other life transitions. Like there are often relationship changes. Sometimes people are changing their position in the workforce. Sometimes, if people have children, those children are growing up. Maybe they're going off to college. Like there are a lot of things that are happening in that moment. And there's this tendency, if someone is complaining about vague symptoms around this window of 40s to 50s, just like, well, it's probably menopause. That's what it's for. And you really have to look at the whole person.
Well, we get that with menstrual stuff too. It's like, oh, it's just your period, and it's like, well, there are levels of, things that are typical for menses and for how your uterus and ovaries are supposed to function. And then there's things that are very much not normal, but things tend to get grouped all together. Like, oh, no, it's okay. It's just, it's just your period.
She has a great chapter all about fiber. She would very much, I think, agree with our fiber fueled episode. You would check that out. But it made me think I have a question for you. Have you eaten Jerusalem artichokes?
I have not. I'm not a fan of artichokes.
Okay.
So
So it's in her chapter because apparently they call it the Jerusalem fartichoke colloquially because it is known to cause a lot of gas apparently. So that's too bad that you're not a fan because I was going to ask you if it happened to you too. Let me go into it. I liked her quote. I want to read it. So she's talking all about like, be a fiber evangelical. Here are all the ways to get more fiber in your diet. She's like, the Jerusalem artichoke can have very high levels of inulin, earning it the well-deserved nickname of fartichoke. I had them once. I eat a lot of fibers, so I felt my colon and I had trained for this moment. I was mistaken. It was the most painful gas I've ever experienced. So that gives you a sense of how this book is real.
Yeah.
And
okay, I'm going to stay clear of that. My colon is very well trained with fiber as well, so I don't imagine it would like that very much. If it's that's pretty good. That's really funny.
Yeah. See, I thought you were going to be my person. I was going to be like,
I do enjoy fiber, but there is too much.
Yeah, she talks all about, contraception options. She loves Mirena IUDs just as much as you and I do and talk about them. And I think one of her other big overarching themes that I'm sure came through in your book is the fact that just because something can be quote unquote natural doesn't mean that there's not a reason to address and treat it.
Yes.
Just like what you were saying, people, menstrual cycles can come with all these challenges and that's part of nature. Just like part of nature would be that people would hemorrhage and die after a normal birth and we treat those things, and so we need to treat the discomforts that can go along with menopause the same way.
Absolutely. There is a section about menopause in my book, so it does get a chapter. It's like a little preview, basically. But
coming attractions for your future.
Right, exactly. But a lot of things happen to the vulva and vagina in these transition periods, so that's a really good thing to include. But basically, it's everything in between like everyday practicalities and vagina maintenance kind of stuff, skincare, cleansing. She talks about different conditions, like yeast, bacterial vaginosis.
I thought you say different conditioners. I was like, Ruby, wait a minute.
Didn't you know about those?
I'm sure somewhere online is selling them. Yeah.
Yeah. Then I say conditioner. Yep. I see it. No, conditions. So like yeast infection, bacterial vaginosis, vulvodynia. So that's painful. And then pelvic floor spasm and vaginismus. So a lot of things that a lot of people experience that don't probably get talked about a lot. Or one thing that she did talk about is that speculum exam. It's not supposed to be painful. It's not super comfortable, of course, but if it is very, very painful, probably because there is a condition with the pelvic floor or you're having something that is causing that pain, or it could be technique. So not all providers are created equal in terms of their speculum skills, and there definitely is a gentle way of doing it, and it can be quite traumatizing for people. Both of us have had patients that have come in that are quite terrified of anything that involves the speculum, which is very unfortunate because it really shouldn't be that way.
Well, it just still baffles me too that people don't seem to realize that this is something that if you're doing it regularly, like that's what you should be doing, is doing this regularly. Like we both had patients who come to us for an HSG after having a failed attempt elsewhere. And you hear the description of like, I was there for an hour and they kept poking and prodding. And they said, oh, they just couldn't find my cervix. And, we're done in 5 minutes. And you realize, oh my gosh, that poor person probably had some, radiologist, which bless them, they're wonderful. But like, if you haven't touched a speculum in 5 years, like maybe you're not the best person to be doing this test.
There is a technique. Some of us are very good at it, I would say. Same with inseminations and things like that, where we have to visualize the cervix. There's sometimes where like, oh, everyone's told me that my cervix is really hard to find. And then you're like, boop, boop, there it is.
Yeah, exactly.
That being said, some people do have very tricky cervixes.
Yeah. Back when I was doing my rotations at Planned Parenthood, I actually loved getting to be someone's first like pelvic exam or speculum, because if you can really kind of explain to the person, ask them what they would like to make it be a little less scary, and you can have the legs frog leg instead of in stirrups, you can do all this stuff, and then people are usually so anxious, and when they're like, oh, that actually, again, it's never gonna be anyone's favorite thing, but they're like, oh, that wasn't that bad, and then you're not setting someone up for this like lifetime of dreading anytime that they're considering having to have a speculum, because just like no one loves getting their blood drawn, but it's a thing that has to be done sometimes to get the tests that we need, but there are ways to make it easier.
Yeah, and that just shows that just even a little bit of care, and a little bit of like, hey, how could this be easiest for you? How can I make you as comfortable as possible? That just shows that it is possible to have those experiences and have them not be traumatizing.
Definitely. So my final thing, my book that I want to read, because I just love it, in her final chapter is the last page of the book.
Oh, I'm curious because I have
it's
mine.
It's probably similar to yours. Oh, do you want to go first then? You can do yours.
Let's compare. Power and health are inseparably linked. Basically, she says, in her conclusion, that she has often been the subject of ridicule and attack because of her coming out against a lot of women's health misinformation and the patriarchy and things like that, and how choice for how we treat our bodies requires us to have accurate facts. And quote, I want every woman to have the power that comes with knowing how their body works and how to look for help when it's not working as it should.
Yeah, mine is, again, like that, but a little angrier.
I didn't read the last sentence, so maybe that's where it was.
Sorry,
Did it involve swinging a bat? Because that's what mine was.
Oh, okay. But mine builds on that. So mine is saying, entering the menopause transition, I was already pissed about the unequal medical and societal burden created by uterus, ovaries, vagina, and vulva, as if they're the barbed wire on a mud-filled obstacle course. But after running that gauntlet, instead of emerging to the menopausal fields of glory, what instead was awaited was a reboot of Women 2.0, a less desirable upgrade with another set of medical hurdles to tolerate. More ways to suck it up and be judged as lesser than men. It's as if you get to do it all over again, but worse because now are you considered old. But then at the end, she says, when we're told by a patriarchal society the story of menopause is one about deserted youth, frailty, and diminished worth. But the story I want you to remember is about value, agency, voice, and the knowledge to keep yourself in the best of health while demanding an equal seat at the table.
Oh.
So again, I definitely think probably all our listeners are either possess vagina, vulva, or spend some time near one. And so definitely they could all do your book. But I want people to see that there's a lot of value from my book too, even if you're not necessarily into that menopausal transition, understanding it. Again, it's puberty in reverse. If you get how these hormones change on one side, which is useful information for anyone that's in that fertility phase, it's kind of fascinating to see how things change on the other side.
Now I have to include her last statement because yours was so good. It says, I am not going to stop swinging my bat until everyone has the tools to be an empowered patient, and those who seek to subjugate women by keeping them from facts about their bodies have shut up and taken a seat in the back of the class.
Nice.
Right? I'm clap, clap, clap. Yeah. And it's one thing that was really nice about this book is I was it felt like you had somebody in your corner. I'm so appreciative that there is somebody that's out there fighting the misinformation.
Yeah.
So thank you, Dr. Gunter.
Yes, you're my hero. I've admired you for so long, and it's kind of fun to sit down and read the books. It's also always a little scary when you've only read people's short pieces because you're like, uh-oh, what if I read this whole book and 4 chapters in, I'm like, oh, we don't agree on a lot of stuff. But that is not true. Every chapter, I was like, yes, you talk about those bioidenticals. And it was just a joy to read and sort of reinforce with a lot of scientific knowledge the things that, I really feel and try and do in my practice.
Yeah. And it was just presented in such a relatable way and with some humor, which is great because otherwise, who wants to read a book about just anatomy and things like that? If it's just dull, no one wants to read a textbook for fun. These are very relatable and very much needed.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Jen Gunter. And thank you to our listeners for way back in the day voting on these to be books for us to review. So we will continue with more of these in the year to come. And if you have suggestions for us, go ahead and send us an email.
thewholepineapple@gmail.com, or you can send us a message on Instagram at thewholepineapplepod.
We'll be back next week with more information. Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the Whole Pineapple Podcast. We hope it was helpful.
If you know someone who could benefit from hearing the podcast, we hope you'll share it with them.
And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review The Whole Pineapple on your favorite podcast app. Every rating and review makes us easier to find.
This podcast is sponsored by Seattle Reproductive Medicine and is produced by Audiotocracy Podcast Production. We'll see you next time. Have a delicious week.